Dear friends of the Conference of European Churches, brothers and sisters, I warmly welcome you to this webinar this afternoon on the theme, the impact of COVID-19 on churches, positive outcomes. Churches have been heavily impacted by the pandemic. Interdiction of worship service, interdiction of gathering and festive celebrations, restrictions or interdiction of visiting people who are elder, alone, isolated, or in elderly homes, as well as hospitalized people, suspension of Eucharist, interdiction on meetings. I guess you had the opportunity to share your reflection on your experience of the pandemic in the past months. But at the same time, all these restrictions have stimulated the imagination and aroused the creativity of pastors, priests, and church leaders to invent new ways, new means to accompany people, to offer them spiritual nourishment, to maintain individual link or community link. Some have embarked on a digitalization of the church. We speak of a church 2.0. And for them, the pandemic functions as an accelerator of change. Others, using more classical means, have developed an epistolary ministry or telephone ministry. In some places, they just went through a desert. This webinar has been organized to collect and share these initiatives and developments, and to start a reflection together on the evolution we are experiencing, the face of the church life that emerges. It was planned, and you can see it on the invitation you received, that the Vice President of CEC, Bishop Dr. Gulli Francis Decani, would moderate this webinar. As she is not able to attend and ask me to apologize for this delay, I thought it would be very useful to entrust this task to our General Secretary. He arrived in CEC in January 2020, just a few weeks before the lockdown, and most of you didn't get the opportunity to meet him. And this is an opportunity to see his face and to have a first contact with him. I will give the moderation now to the General Secretary, but previously a short greeting also from His Eminence Metropolitan Cleopas, Orthodox Vice President of CEC. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Dearly beloved brothers and sisters in Christ, it gives me great pleasure to greet you, all of you today during the framework of the 2021 General Assembly of the CEC. While today's meeting is being conducted virtually, I add my prayers and hopes to those existing in your hearts and souls for a quick return to in-person meetings as new treatments and preventive measures to combat the epidemic challenging us for the past year and a half continue to be rolled out in countries around the world gradually prepare for the post-COVID era. Today's assembly finds our churches and societies facing major challenges, many arising directly from the effects of the epidemic, and others that pre-existed but were made even more acute by the disruption of our daily norms. During these most difficult times, humanity banded together, and people from every sector in country collaborated to help neutralize this deadly disease that sprang upon us with the speed and stealthiness of a venomous viper. At the same time, however, Christians around the world were faced with striking provocations. Governments hastened to shut down churches and intervene in the sacramental life of the church and divine worship without so much as consulting religious leaders or working to find mutually agreed upon solutions. Christians worldwide were targeted by certain politicians, members of the media, and their fellow citizens. The vast experience of the church is dealing with disease and safeguarding the health of its flock, which far outdates that of all nation states and current international entities, was largely overlooked, with all the consequences that this entails for society and its citizens. Nonetheless, it is through these tribulations and trials that the church grows stronger and the faithful search for the presence of God in their lives all the more intensely. Today's afternoon session will feature a stimulating discourse on the impact of COVID-19 on churches and whether or not there were any positive outcomes from it. Like all of you, I look forward to hearing the views of the distinguished guests who have been invited to speak. Our keynote speaker, Reverend Dr. Richard Sudworth, as well as Reverend Protopresbyter Stavros Kofinas, and Reverend Dr. Vilmos Vishla. While the battle against the coronavirus continues to be fought daily, today's assembly will allow us to take the time and reflect on successes and shortcomings experienced by our churches in this struggle, as well as consider the state of other key issues like migration, poverty, democracy, and the role of our churches in contemporary society. One of the things that this crisis has demonstrated is that churches remain essential and must be recognized as such by governments worldwide and social partners. My humble opinion, the CEC's advocacy for this cause can provide a great service to our individual and collective ministries. I wish you all health and fruitful participation in today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Krieger and Vice President Metropolitan Cleopas, for these words of introduction. And as mentioned by President Krieger, I've agreed to take over the moderation of today's or this afternoon's session, which I'm very pleased to do, and I'm happy to be able to, well, if not to see all of the participants, and at least to know that there are some out there that are listening to our elaborations this afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and it's a pleasure to be able to moderate this this session. As you know, this is, I think we've all had the experience over the last, well, 16, 17, 18 months now, to be in webinars where there's, and ordinary meetings on screen via a variety of software platforms. And in most meetings, there is a session where we speak about all the troubles we've had as churches during the COVID-19 crisis, all the things that we've not been able to do, and how this has had a negative impact on church life. And certainly this has been the case. It's been highlighted already by the president and the vice president of CEC. However, by this webinar, we thought that maybe this would be the opportunity to look at some of, if any, if there would be any positive impact from this crisis also on church life. As a matter of fact, it came out of a conversation I had with the Ecumenical Officer of Church of England, relatively newly appointed, Dr. Isabel Hamley, some months ago, where she was talking about some positive impacts in the Church of England. which he believed came out of this sanitary crisis. So we thought we would invite a couple of speakers, 3 speakers this afternoon, to speak on potential positive outcome or positive impact on our churches, since we all know what the negative impact has been on our fellowships throughout Europe in our churches. Now, I'm happy to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, which is indeed from the Church of England. Dr. Isabel Hamley was unable to speak to us this afternoon, but she generously pointed to a very good substitute, Reverend Dr. Richard Sudworth, who is the Secretary for Interreligious Affairs to the Archbishop of Canterbury and National Interreligious Affairs Advisor for the Church of England. Dr. Reverend Richard will speak to us for about 25 minutes, and then we have invited 2 respondees, respecting the tradition of having all church families represented, of all church families in KEC represented at this webinar. So we will have Father Stavros Kofinas speaking, giving a reflection, a response to what has been shared with us in the keynote address. Father Stavros is the coordinator of the network of the Ecumenical Patriarchate for Pastoral Care. And finally, a reflection or response by Reverend Dr. Vilmos Fischel, General Secretary of the Ecumenical Council of Churches in Hungary. They will both have approximately 10 minutes for their responses. However, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Reverend Dr. Richard Sudworth. And I believe you have a PowerPoint presentation that you would like to be shared on screen during your presentation this afternoon. I will ask my assistant, Veronique Engels, to share that on screen now.
Wonderful.
The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that welcome. I think my colleague, Dr. Isabel Hamley, would have been here, but in the context of the topic we have under discussion, she's one of those with long COVID. So ever since the virus really hit early last year, Isabel has been struggling on and off with very difficult symptoms of COVID. So that reality is close to home. So positive outcomes, this is a question mark, and I'm going to reflect primarily from the place of the Church of England, but as you will hear, there are broader positive reflections in some instances. So I wonder if we could just have the next slide, please. I will occasionally instruct for the slide that we have on the screen. I hope that's all clear for you. So since March of 2020 in the UK, places of worship have been and continue to be subject to severe strictures, from complete closure to very limited attendance numbers and no public singing, which is where we're at the moment. This has meant that the comfort, encouragement and fellowship of Christian gatherings have not been available to churches. In this paper, I will focus particularly on the developments that have taken place in the Church of England around online worship during the pandemic and the strengthened role of faith in the public square as 2 strands of positive outcomes from this last 18 months. Have the next slide, please. When the shutdown of churches was announced by the government in March 2020, a rush decision was made to produce a national online service that would be pre-recorded and released on Facebook and YouTube for what was then Mothering Sunday in our church calendar. A team overseeing subsequent online services was hastily assembled, involving central church digital professionals, clergy, communication staff, and several local diocesan representatives. For Easter Sunday, Archbishop Justin Welby presided at a Eucharist at his kitchen table in that recorded service, the high point of the Christian year, modelling the pragmatic creativity that was being imposed on all clergy. The resource of a national online service acknowledges that in the over 16,500 parish churches, many do not have the capabilities to film and publish services of worship or to offer an appropriate quality of music. Depending on the relative stages of lockdown, and like many other countries, we're at different stages with different kind of rigors with regard to what's permissible. Depending on the relative stages of lockdown, the national provision has drawn from a library of pre-recorded hymns and songs, accessed COVID-compliant professional choirs, or filmed local choirs, as well as now guiding us through a full church calendar with its seasons and festivals. Themed Sundays have included services that have featured, for example, one led by a prison chaplain. And for the first time ever, this provided Christian worship simultaneously and including prisoners, prison staff, and their families in their homes. We've had a service focusing on a chaplain to the elderly, services focused on Black history and disability, and many others. Furthermore, across the diversity of traditions that are represented by the Church of England, and as you know, we are quite a mix from Reform to Catholic and all the way through, there has been a stated intention to reflect the diversity of the Church and to embed the national online offer with flavours of the local in worship and in theology. Here's a brief rundown of key statistics for the online services. For each service, the national online service, average views are over 194,000. Each service receives average of nearly 300 comments, and 42.3 million times the services have been accessed throughout the year, and 1.2 million total engagement so far across all services. We go on to the next slide, please. What's particularly interesting about the breakdown of the statistics is the profile of those tuning in. 1 in 5 of our viewers were not regular attendees at church before lockdown. 13% of people who answered, and we've done surveys throughout this time, who answered the Sunday service survey said they used to go to church quarterly, once, twice a year, or never. So 13% of people who've tuned in really had very minimal attendance at church. 15% of people said before lockdown they went to church monthly or less, including never. 15% of viewers across Facebook and YouTube were 34 and under. And the Church of England has a demographic profile that's really tipped more towards the elderly. So here we have a national online service where 15% of viewers are 34 and under by age. The services are filling a gap in the market where local churches are not able to provide online services. 20% of people said it was their first Church of England online service. And interestingly, 50% of viewers attend every week. And if you were to look at the YouTube and Facebook comments, there are lots of little communities springing up. And this is globally as well. People who are tuning in, finding comfort and encouragement, and seeing other people they recognize each week, and then building up community offline outside of this particular provision. What is clear then is that there's an opportunity in outreach, in the proclamation of the gospel, as well as in accessing a demographic that are too often underrepresented, certainly in our church. Correspondence to the digital team and comments online show how the online service is generating a series of new communities with participants involved around the world and communicating amongst themselves through the week. These national online services are complementing thousands of local online services that are either broadcast live on Zoom or another platform, or YouTube, or pre-recorded. So there's a sense of the national being a central resource, but complementing what is happening locally. Have the next slide, please. For one particular community of viewers, the national online provision has been an overdue resource, regardless of the pandemic. For those who are housebound for whatever reason, online church services have been a lifeline that have hitherto only been available through specialist disability groups. So there is a champion of disability groups in the Church of England, and she will say, suddenly the church is catching up to what we've had to do ourselves for those who are housebound and disabled. And suddenly we've all been housebound at some point during this lockdown, and this online provision is now addressing a hidden part of our national life anyway. The privations that have been imposed on all of us have awakened us to the privations that many have always lived with. And naturally, there are huge theological and ecclesiological questions are raised by this move to online church. I'm not going to endeavour to answer these, and it may come up in the responses and in Q&A. But in highlighting this new opportunity in the midst of the destructiveness of the pandemic, I do need to recognise the complexities that we now face. As with all online communities, to what extent is physical embodied presence a necessary constituent of community? What does all this mean for the embodied presence of Eucharistic community? What are the catechetic practices that would disciple online inquiries and converts into baptism and full participation in the local church? Indeed, for the National Church of England, how do we draw these connections, the connections of this online presence, to the diocesan and parochial expressions of church community? Whatever the answers to these questions, it is evident that the pandemic has pushed the church into a much more responsive and proactive disposition with online communities, and that we are facing the prospect of what many are beginning to call hybrid church. Here in the UK, July the 19th is expected to be the date when most restrictions are lifted. But we do expect the national online services to continue. Many local churches too will still be offering an online provision alongside their in-person gatherings. All the available research suggests that there will not be the same level of physical attendance as the pre-pandemic era, such that online church will be a determining factor in our worshiping life going forward. Now let's look at the other strand, the church in the public square. If we have the next slide, please. One obvious feature of the pandemic has been the almost unprecedented ways in which governments have issued health guidelines demanding the imposition of restraints on usual freedoms. These restraints have been channeled through national and local governments. As stated earlier, in March 2020, the decision to instruct all places of worship to close communal worship was imposed nationally. This simple fact obscures a whole nest of complexity around what constitutes communal worship and what might be permissible for the celebration of weddings and the commemoration of funerals in religious settings. As lockdown strictures were gradually eased, these complexities became even more palpable, with public health questions around singing, spacing, hygiene at the Eucharist and in church buildings, monitoring and control of buildings, and distinctions between professional and amateur choirs as the messy overlaps across education, culture, entertainment, and faith disciplines emerged. Throughout this process, faith communities and their leaders have been vital dialogue partners with national and local governments. In order for many of the COVID restrictions to land effectively across the country, faith leaders have needed to be consulted, and indeed, a faith working group has regularly met with the government. A positive outcome from the pandemic has seemed to be a greater appreciation of the role of the church and other faith traditions in the public life of the nation. Whilst the presenting trajectory for this dialogue has been largely top-down, and faith groups have arguably been instrumentalised towards the goal of COVID prevention, there has undeniably been a renewed dynamic to government and faith partnership. A recently published report published by an independent consultancy on faiths in public life looking at the outcomes of the pandemic concludes the following, and I quote from the report. A series of executive interviews with senior faith leaders, grassroots activists and interfaith professionals further demonstrate both the complex nature of faith communities and the broad range of skills and services that faith groups have deployed through the crisis. The report recommends a covenant between government and faith communities that builds on the experiences through the pandemic when religious groups were at the forefront in supporting many of the lockdown measures, not all and not all the time, and advocating for appropriate health and hygiene measures. In grappling with the complexities and diversities within and across traditions, there is a sense that local and national governments have had to deepen their religious literacy to get things done. With some more conservative communities, Christian and otherwise, rates of vaccine hesitancy have been high, and again, local and national governments have worked with faith leaders, often used as role models, and enabled vaccine centres in churches, for example, to undermine the myths that have abounded. The report that I quoted from earlier, entitled Stepping Up and Stepping Out, looks forward and challenges government to build on the recognition of the vital role of faith communities in social transformation. Their leadership in the provision of food banks, visiting of the isolated elderly and those with mental illness, for example. These grassroots projects that the Church of England has been especially noted for have become ever more important through the pandemic. The report argues as a consequence that, quote, our faith communities stand ready to serve our nationwide recovery in the days, months and years ahead. From being necessary instruments in the mitigation of the pandemic, churches and other faith groups are revealed as partners to government in the exercise of the common good. Additionally, this kind of church-government partnership has also been expressed ecumenically and with other faith traditions. Whilst the Church of England has a natural establishment linked to public life, the national and local faith fora have enabled a richer and more diverse engagement than hitherto. Many of the newer Black-led churches, for example, have played much more prominent roles in dialogue with government for mutual learning and gain. Inevitably and properly, the dialogues have included advocacy and challenge over the extent of restrictions at various points. At a very early stage in the pandemic, for example, it was feared that the number of deaths would be so great in our cities that hurried burials would be needed without any religious rite, and even that cremations would become mandatory should cemeteries become too full. It was made clear by faith leaders working together that some form of rite should be allowed for every deceased, and that religious traditions would be flexible in responding speedily and with brevity if necessary. So that was a shared voice of challenge to government, and they agreed because of that shared advocacy. There was also combined advocacy with and on behalf of Jewish, Muslim and other traditions for whom cremation is an unacceptable practice. In summary, the pandemic has witnessed a stronger and more vigorous engagement between churches and government at local and national levels. This engagement has been much more attentive to the complexities and diversities of lived faith and set a pattern for our emergence out of the pandemic as partners in the public arena. A final slide, please. So, in conclusion, central to our Christian story is a vision of hope that would see even the darkest of suffering having the potential for transformation and redemption. This narrative is one that requires us to listen to the work of God in our own lives and in the life of the world around us. Moving out of the worst of the pandemic in the UK we are still very mindful of its likely impact for many years to come. This impact will be keenly felt on the finances and physical attendance figures of the Church of England, as it will be for other churches and faith traditions. Yet, throughout all this, the emergence of online church has offered hope to so many, and the place of faith in the transformative role of the church in the public square come to the fore in unprecedented ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sudworth, for your presentation this afternoon. I came to think of an image or a picture I saw in a British newspaper at the beginning of the vaccination period, where I think a cathedral of the Church of England was used as a vaccination center. Now, I was vaccinated myself in a military hospital, which was fine. But I mean, to sit there in a cathedral to have your vaccinations and have your jabs, whilst the musician was playing on the organ, I found that really a sign of, I mean, just a beautiful image of what was happening. and I think that was reflected, this kind of creativity also in your presentation this afternoon. So thank you very much for that. There will be an opportunity, of course, to raise questions to Dr. Sudworth and to this keynote address. But before that, I would like to invite our two respondents to share with us in their 10-minute slots their response to what we have heard in the keynote address, and also maybe to add to that from their own traditions. Meanwhile, the attendees of this webinar, you can start thinking about your questions. We will receive short and precise questions, as always, in the chat of this webinar. I hope you can find the chat button on your screens, so you can write your questions in the chat, and I will see if I can get them sorted out and address some of them to the right people. Please write short, precise questions or comments, and please also let me know to whom you are addressing your questions. But that will happen in the background, so to speak. First of all, I would like to invite Father Stavros Kofinas to respond to what we've heard so far this afternoon. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, Father Stavros is the coordinator of the network of the Ecumenical Patriarchate for Pastoral Care. Please, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. I would first like to thank Dr. Sørensen and Mrs. Ingalls of Keck for their invitation to take part in this important dialogue. And I thank the Reverend Sudworth for his informative presentation. One of the main characteristics of Orthodox Christian thought is the way it approaches God and life in an apophatic manner. It is by unknowing that one may know, particularly to come to know God, who is above every object of knowledge. Thus, proceeding by negations, one can ascend from the inferior degrees of being to the highest. On a personal level, to come to know who I am, it is necessary for me to realize and accept who I am not, how I have missed the mark, so as to return to what is truly is to be truly, being in union with God. As theoretical and abstract as this may sound, it is relevant to our discussion. It has been said that crises allow us to see what is not evident, even though it lays before our eyes. Anna Arendt wrote that only when an instrument breaks down, we are able to perceive it, and so we can repair it. If the COVID-19 virus has positive aspects, is that it revealed all the negative aspects and consequences of the way we have structured our life and our society over the past decades, and how we deal with the various realities that accompany life. Even the tragic consequences of the pandemic itself, which Reverend Sudworth cited, have allowed us to face and deal with situations that we never suspected we would have dealt with in the past. Allow me to expand a bit what was well stated by Reverend Sudworth's opening remarks. The COVID virus debunked the myth that there are no limits of human omnipotence, that we can control every aspect of life, and that growth can be ever-ending. It has shown us how powerlessness and fearful we really are. The denial of the virus's existence and its consequences indicate the arrogance and the fear that characterizes our post-modern world. If there is now fear and panic, it is because one fears that he or she will not be able to control one's life, lose one's freedom to continue the normality of satisfying one's desires. The new norm brought on by the pandemic brought to light the limitations of satisfying our desires. More so, the pandemic drastically brought us before the reality of death in a way we never have ever seen in our times. Western society has made many efforts to either deny or beautify death. The number of those who have been succumbed to the virus and the mass graves projected by mass media bring us before the tragedy of death and life together. In facing death, one faces and has to come to grips with the meaning and the values of life, one's emptiness and the significance or lack of significance of human existence. All of these limitations in face of death allow us to seek God's grace and even more, to reevaluate our whole being. Reverend Sudworth stated that with the use of modern cyber technology, churches were able to reach out to their flock, overcoming the barriers posed by the restrictions placed by the governments regarding worship and gatherings, allowing evangelization to take place in the time of crisis. The question which I would like to pose is if this evangelization addressed the fear of death and one's belief or lack of faith in eternity. From my own experiences, since the beginning of the pandemic, the issue of our fear of death and our belief in eternity was not adequately dealt with. Faith seemed to be dealt with as a given. You must have faith, and belief in eternal life as well. Many clergy preached that our faith would protect us from the virus or help us deal with it. But it seems that the underlying statement that was given was that if we have faith, we will be able to continue the normal life we led before the pandemic without fear. But this message does not allow for change, repentance, or spiritual growth. This type of evangelizing leads to a fundamentalism that seems to prevail in many ecclesiastical communities, a fundamentalism that segregates and isolates rather than unites, that forms complexities and dilemmas that bring on guilt and anger in both believers and non-believers. Fundamentalism projects that one is pure, but St. Gregory Palamas states, if one considers him or herself pure, one is in deceit. If humility is not in one's heart, one cannot be sanctified. And talking about the sanitary crisis, we have the opportunity to talk about the meaning of purity within a Christian context that will help us combat the sick type of religiosity that often prevails. The numbers that our main speaker presented are impressive. What remains to be seen is if those who follow us on the screen will follow up in coming to worship after the restrictions are lifted. Christian worship is not a private affair between me and God. It is a renewal and sanctification of the world in participating in the sanctity of God's presence and love. As it is an ecclesiastical happening, celebration, that encompasses the human being as a whole within the unity and wholeness of the ecumeny. This includes the body and the soul. Thus we sing, taste and see how good the Lord is. Even in dealing with our faith and disbelief, the full participation of our being is necessary. Christ tells the doubting Thomas, come and feel the print of the nails and the wound on my side. And worship, all of our senses are activated so as to unite the one amongst others. We are thus before a new challenge of catechism that will make worship a way of life rather than a formality. Without refuting the statistics presented, unfortunately, there's another perspective as to how people have seen the church during the time of pandemic. Many have lost their faith in the church because of its inability to address their existential concerns regarding life and death. The underlying conservative element that seems to prevail in many aspects of church life have turned off those that seek something more than dogmatic principles that they must adhere to. Perhaps the most positive aspect of the pandemic is that it will force us to reevaluate the way we evangelize the gospel to a world that remains in dismay and discord. This is our hope.
Thank you very much, Father Stavros, for your reflection. I think what you say, I think you mentioned that this is also the sanitary crisis has been a reminder that we cannot control everything. I think that has been a reminder to many people that sometimes the world is beyond our control. I have already a question relating to that, but I will save that for a bit later. And I would invite Dr. Vilmos Fischel to take the floor for 10 minutes. But before I do that, Dr. Richard Sudworth, may I invite you also at the end of the second intervention here, also as a response, maybe to reflect on what has been said in the two responses. So Vilmos Fischel, you are invited to take the floor and share with us your insights. 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Secretary Sørensen, Reverend Dr. Sudworth and Father Kofinas. It was very good to hear and listen your thoughts about COVID-19. When I get this title, I was thinking on it that is there any income of the COVID-19? Is there any income? And I wrote to my paper three question marks, because I have to think very strongly, is there any income from this COVID-19? First of all, of course, mainly I can talk about Hungary and the Hungarian churches. The Ecumenical Council of Churches in Hungary have 11 member churches, Reformed, Lutheran, Baptist, Pentecost, Methodist, Anglican, and we have 5 Orthodox churches: Romanian, Bulgarian, Serbian, Moscow Patriarchate, and Constantinople Patriarchate. And the Roman Catholic Church is observer cooperating partner. So, representing these churches, General Secretary, I did a research, of course, when I was preparing for this event. I would like to talk about the helpline. You might know that a lot of people were mentally shocked because of this COVID-19. So we ecumenically made a helpline. We thought it would be good if from our member churches, pastors who are having an extra diploma from mental hygiene will handle the lines, and we did it. And I have to tell you honestly, very few people called this line. We would think that a lot of people calls this line. No. In Hungary, very few people called this this helpline. So after 1 month, we had to finish it because there were so little people, amount of people who were phoning this line. It's just very interesting. I wanted to mention this. Let me talk about the TV broadcast. Of course, the pastors had to change their life, so they became operators and cameramen in Hungary. So through the Facebook, through the YouTube channels, they were broadcasting. Sometimes one church member helped, sometimes a wife or a child helped for the pastor to broadcast. It was an interesting period to see the different type of broadcastings all over our member churches. And somehow it is important. But on other hand, we have to think now again that is the broadcast is good or bad? Because in Hungary we have a custom. On Sundays, the housewives are doing big meals. It's a Hungarian custom. So it happened that the housewives now were staying at home. They were making the meal and watching, of course, the broadcasting from the television or from YouTube or from Facebook. And now these people, after the church is reopened, are staying at home because it is easier for a lot of people to stay at home to do their work because they can see at the television, they can get the spiritual income through the Facebook, through the YouTube. Why should they go to church if they can see? So I think we have to rethink that. Is it good if at the same time when on Sunday, for example, at 10 o'clock, the worship starts, should we online broadcast, or let's say we can make a record and after 2 days we can put it to the Facebook or to the YouTube, but not at the same time when the worship is beginning at the church. So I think we have to rethink now a lot of things because now we try to catch our normal life. If there is normal life in the future, we have to deal with this question also. Let's talk about how hard it was for the pastors to broadcast. They had to speak to the benches in the church, for example. There were no people. They had to speak to the benches, to an empty church. How hard it is for a pastor to talk to empty church, and of course after the camera there are people, but he or she had to preach to empty churches. I think this is also hard for a pastor's soul to preach to an empty church. Let's talk about the tightenings, the restrictions. In Hungary, the Hungarian government said that the church has no restrictions. The church can do what they did. So the churches had freedom in Hungary during the pandemic period. But the bishops said it is very kind from the government that we can have freedom. But of course, we understand it, that they don't want to reach inside the life of the churches. So the churches themselves did the restrictions themselves. There were some churches like the Reform or the Lutheran or the Baptist church where the pastors were broadcasting and the church members could not go for a month to the church. But in the Catholic Church, for example, the Catholic Church didn't close. So in Hungary, the Roman Catholic Church was all the time open during the pandemic period. They didn't close at all. Or the Orthodox churches also, they didn't close. Although the Orthodox churches are not big in Hungary, we have 5 Orthodox churches. Altogether, there are 14,000 church members because these are small Orthodox churches in Hungary. So what I wanted to say that the big Catholic Church in Hungary was open, but the Protestant churches and the Anglican Church were closed during the pandemic period. What happened? For example, and it is very hard to talk about it, a lot of pastor colleagues died in the Catholic Church also, and in other churches also. So it was also for us very hard that that we lost a lot of church members because of the coronavirus, and we lost, of course, several colleagues, and not only old, young colleagues also we lost. Let's talk about a little bit the Holy Communion. The Holy Communion, the Eucharisty, was not done during the COVID-19 in the Protestant churches. In the Orthodox and the Catholic Church, yes, but in the Protestant churches and the Anglican members, no. So it was, of course, a hunger for the people, for the church members, that they wanted to have Holy Communion. And now it's very interesting because in this year, you might know that we will have the International Eucharistic Congress in Hungary. This is the 52 International Eucharistic Congress in Hungary. So it means that on September, 12th of September, Francis Pope will come to Hungary also, and will be there during this International Eucharistic Conference. Cardinal Peter Erdő, the Cardinal of the Catholic Church, just called me 2 hours ago, and we were speaking about these things, that how we, as a Ecumenical Council of Churches, can help or can assist or can participate to this Eucharistic Congress. And of course, the churches has institutes in Hungary, schools, diacony institutes for elder people, and the churches had to take care of these institutes also. We should never forget that we are not only talking about those people who are going to church or not going to church. We are talking about institutes where the churches are responsible. And we have a lot of church schools, thanks God, in Hungary, for example. And also it was hard for the church to deal with this COVID-19 with the children who couldn't come to school all the time, and they had to change their life also. And I would like to talk a very interesting thing. I know that in the western part of Europe, it's not a problem because it's in another way. But in the eastern part of Europe, like in Hungary, it was a problem, and this is financial problem, because in the church, if you are taking the church tax, in your countries, the government is taking it and give it to you. In Hungary, no. In Hungary, the congregations locally take from the people the church tax. This is our tradition, our custom. Not the government is collecting, like in your countries. So it means that because people didn't come to church, didn't attend on Sundays, they didn't pay the church tax, and they didn't put money to the money box. So a lot of pastors could not afford to pay the light, the water, and they couldn't take their salary. So it was financially also a big problem for the pastors in Hungary, because the member of the churches didn't come. They couldn't give the church tax, the church tax. So this is another kind of interesting challenge, let's say that. What can we do with those pastors or church members who are against vaccination? Because we have some pastors and church members as well who say they're anti-vaccination. They will not want. Can that pastor work as a pastor in a congregation where everybody is vaccinated, for example, if he is not vaccinated? Can that church member take the Holy Communion if only he or she is not vaccinated and everybody is vaccinated? So there are a lot of open questions with which we have to deal in the future. I don't know the exact answer, so please forgive me. But we have to deal with these questions. And of course, we lived, I think, too well. We lived in a good mood. And God changed our life. We should not forget whom we belong. I think this is also important to think about it. And at last, I think that we must ask that will we have the same life now as we had before? And my answer is, with the 3 exclamation mark, no. We will not have the same life after COVID-19. Everything has changed, and we have to get used to this new world. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vilmos Fischel, for your for your intervention and for your reflection also on the situation. It's interesting to hear how you, of course, as General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, you speak on behalf of many different traditions, and therefore you are able to enlighten us from a variety of positions in Hungary. So that's quite interesting to have that angle on things also. Now I have already a handful of questions now, enough to stir a full seminar, or for a whole week of discussions on the impact of the current sanitary crisis, if we go deep enough. But before we do that, and I would still encourage people to raise questions, because that's what we can do in a webinar like this one. But before we do that, well, not before you ask your questions, you can do that as we go along. But before we start asking your good questions, I invite again our keynote speaker, Dr. Richard Sudworth, to say a few words on what you heard from the 2 responses. And then we will dive into the questions immediately after that. We have another half hour, 30 minutes available. Please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Father Kofinas, you shared a wonderful example of Orthodox theology in reflecting, and it warms the cockles of my heart as someone who previous Archbishop Rowan Williams, who's introduced me to a lot of the richness that you shared. And I just want to echo the challenge that we didn't always get right in the Church of England, but there were some moments that I can certainly identify with on this, about the COVID crisis, returning the Church to its countercultural task of talking about death. The last Easter Sunday, which was the second Easter Sunday under lockdown, Archbishop Justin led a televised live stream service from Canterbury Cathedral, and the purpose of that, the sermon, and it was broadcast on BBC as well for Easter Sunday, was indeed to try and do that, to talk about death, that we need to reckon with us being mortal beings and accountable before God. I'm not sure we always did that, but I think we have had a real challenge to get away from a consumerist model of spirituality that has infected the Church in the West, for sure. And I really do hear the question marks around those numbers and the engagement online, and what that translates to in terms of local lived physical discipleship, which also includes, leading on to Dr. Fischel and what he raised, amongst what he raised, which also includes how we give, both of our time, our service, our calling in working life, and our money. So it's far from clear that the catechesis of the Church is truly linked to the outreach that we have online. And you are not alone in Hungary in being churches that are going to struggle financially. And the Church of England, we're going through a whole review of our structures. There will be closures of churches, more limited resources, and within that same context of our individual mortality and fragility, we are reminded that our church institutions are fragile, and whilst we are within the church Catholic and we have hope, our institutions, well, just because they were more powerful and richer yesterday, we're not dependent on that for tomorrow. Our hope is in Jesus Christ. I also recognize from Dr. Fischl this challenge, which I alluded to with the forecast that we're hearing about how many people are going to come back to church whenever, whatever release of lockdown fully means. I know it from my own family. Well, I'm not going to name names, but I know people close to me who are saying, wow, this is much more convenient sitting at home on a Sunday morning doing some jobs with a screen on in the corner. And whilst, and I didn't mention this because I was talking positive outcomes in my presentation, I talked about the engagement with younger people. In terms of local churches, paradoxically, for the generation that are comfortable on social media, they are not doing church online. In most churches where there are young people, they are not attending online with their communities. So there is work to be done. But thank you for both your reflections.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, both of you. And thank you also for your reflection on the responses. Very helpful to have this sum up halfway. I've got an interesting question here, which I believe is for all of you in the order that you would like to respond to it. It's in a way, it's a deeply theological question, but it's also a question of which touches upon very concrete measures of science in all this. Now, I find it very both encouraging and interesting, this talk about the mortality, fragility, the fact that the church, I think you, Richard Sudworth, used the term that it's the countercultural task of the church to speak about death. We really how could you say not reinvented but re-envisaged that function of the church over the last 18 months. But this question is, and I read it from my screen now, it is quite interesting in this context. It says, has the effectiveness of vaccines in diminishing the more deadly outcomes of COVID actually increased the arrogant confidence in science as the mediator of salvation? Because we have had a period, if we think back to March 2021, we saw pictures from Italy. We saw bodies being taken away in lorries. And nobody knew really what was going to happen. I think we all had the hope that it's, after a few weeks this would be over, but it didn't really happen. And I think everyone had the sense of losing control somehow, and our governments were desperately struggling to keep control for good reasons. But there the church had to pick up that old countercultural role, as it was mentioned. Now we have the vaccines, and they seem to work, some better than others, but they have an impressive impact on what we can do. And people say, finally we can return to normal. Some say to new normal, but still a lot of people believe that now the world will come back to what it used to be. Now, is this a sign of the arrogant confidence in science as the mediator of salvation, which we see the return of? I think this is an interesting question. Who would have of the three speakers, who would like to have a go on this one? You can raise your hand if so. Yes, please, Dr. Richard.
Well, I will give this a go, but I'm not sure that the gift of a vaccine is what prompts the worship of science and arrogance in pretending to immortality. I thank God for the gift of the vaccine. Whether we've had the vaccine or not, what actually underlines our arrogance and our pretension to immortality is when we are not the Church Catholic, because if we are connected with those that are, well, I think in the UK, some of our more deprived communities are still dying from COVID because of their living conditions, and they're maybe homeless. And if we are connected with churches and communities of whatever hue in the South who are suffering from war and famine, then we have reminders enough. And I think that's part of our calling, that human global connection that we have in the church too, but also, so I thank God for the vaccine, but also say, where are we listening to the suffering of the world? Where are we in contact with them?
Thank you so much. Yes, what I hear you saying is that you know, that call for a countercultural role of the church, being able to speak about death, is still there, but we've been reminded in a very strong fashion that this is also part of our task. Would any of the two respondents like to add anything to this question?
I could.
Yes, Father Stavros, please.
The only thing I could add to what Father Richard said was that, first of all, to be arrogant about the vaccine is deceitful, because the vaccine doesn't cover you 100%, which means that there's always a possibility that you can still get sick. And that if we become arrogant about that, then the vaccine is going to fail itself, because that's the way it works. I'm concerned, though, about the whole struggle between science and religion, and churches and science. And I find that it's very difficult. There are a lot of doctors and nurses and scientists who would like to cooperate with the church. A lot of people in the church would like to cooperate with scientists. We haven't seemed to find a working mode between us completely. I think that we have to work on how we can form a better dialogue, and that will help the church not to become arrogant, and the scientists not to become arrogant.
Yes, true. I mean, it's not a matter of a battle between two different views of the world. I guess this is it's more about concern that we see both parts, the spiritual and the scientific, as parts of human life. I guess. Well, interesting. I think this is a question that will stay with us for a while. But also that the conclusion that we draw, that this is, we've been revitalized the idea of the church as an institution that dares to speak about death. Death certainly hasn't been eradicated just because we have the vaccines. I mean, people are still dying, as you said, Dr. Richards. It happens. It has happened all the time. But our eyes may have been opened for it now in a different way. So that could be taken away as a you know, a revived sense of what it is to be a church. There's another question here, which is pertaining to the, let me see, where is it? I try to get hold of all the questions. So there's one here. Yes, that relates to what you said, Vilmos Fischel. I'll read the question or comment here. Dr. Fischel's concern with online broadcasts can be understood, but doesn't it also show that the formats that the churches offer, often mainly Sunday morning service, are not up to date anymore? Shouldn't churches use this opportunity to really consider reinventing or reforming themselves and their offers? Now, depending on how you answer this question, this could be seen as a positive impact on churches. It all comes down to the way you view things, I guess, and also to what kind of tradition you follow. Dr. Fischel, would you like, now this question came out of something you said earlier this afternoon. Would you like to have a go on this one? Is this really an opportunity for churches to think in different ways as to how and when we do worship service in our churches?
Thank you very much for the question. I agree what the questioner wants to say. So we can say, of course, that there is a positive income of this broadcast, because we reached people whom we couldn't reach before. It is true. So we can say that there is a positive income of the COVID-19, that through the broadcast we reached a lot of people whom we couldn't reach before. This is true. I'm not quarreling with this question. My problem is that these people will come to church whom we reach now. They didn't come, maybe yes. It is hypothetical. I don't know, because they are virtuals. And those people who came physically in the church every Sunday, and they didn't come for half a year, can they come back? Will they have the force inside of them? I hope, yes, the Holy Spirit will move them. I hope, I really hope. So they will come back. But the problem is here that we reach people whom we didn't reach before. Here they come to church physically, yes or no? And what about those people who were in the church and we are waiting them back? So the broadcast is positive and negative at the same time, and we have to handle it well. I'm not sure how can we handle it well. I mentioned some examples. For example, let's not broadcast at the same time when we are having the worship. Let's push it a little bit 1 or 2 days later, or in the afternoon on Sunday and not in the morning. So there are several possibilities, but this is a big question in me, and I don't know exactly the answer. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Now, Father Stavros, I would like to address you with this one also. I know that for many, from the Anglican tradition and from Protestant traditions, lots of people are thrilled with the new opportunities in streaming worship services, or streaming on YouTube, or doing televised worship services. But I know also there's been some, I mean, this kind of worship is challenging in the Orthodox tradition. Would you like to say a few words on the particular challenges that you have found in this?
In the Orthodox Church in televising?
Well, the fact that it's been difficult for people to gather physically for worship.
Yeah. All this discussion we've had about worship, I think of a cousin of mine, it's in the United States, who called me up and said, you know, it was really great today because I got up and I turned on TV and there was a service. I took my coffee and I sat down and I slept a little bit through it, but I woke up. It was really great. I would just, yeah, I have the same concerns as everyone else. And I said that this is an opportunity for us to instruct more our people about what worship is, and what Alexander Schmemann, Father Alexander, used to say about the sanctification of time, and how time plays a role in our modern society, and many times is an obstacle in our society. We always have to be busy. We have to start talking about these issues with people and give them another perspective. This is the opportunity. I have a lot of people who cannot go to church, and they enjoy seeing church. the other I think positive thing about all this is that people are able cross-culturally to see each other. People in America will be able to see the services in Europe. I'm able to get on and see Father Richard's sermon, and there's an exchange. But again, it's going to be a problem, and it's an opportunity, though.
Dr. Richard Sudworth, how is it? You're saying that a lot of things is happening in Church of England, also because of financial issues. Is this an opportunity for you in your church to reconsider how you see the nature of being church in modern times?
Yes, but it's I suspect that the diversity that I'm going to express is evident to some extent across all our traditions, but you will appreciate the huge diversity of the Church of England, as I said earlier, from Reform to Catholic. And let me share an anecdote which perhaps may help this. But I was in my interfaith capacity in a discussion with the Chief Rabbi of the UK and the Roman Catholic Cardinal and the Archbishop. And this is not going to be a joke about a pub, and we were all discussing the difficulties of lockdown and the impact on our respective worshipping communities. And the Chief Rabbi's response was, it's about protecting life. The key forum for worship in the Jewish tradition is the home. The Roman Catholic Cardinal said, well, actually, this is extraordinarily difficult for us because the church is the place where we receive the gift of the Eucharist, the body of Christ, and that is a great deprivation for us. The Church of England, in that discussion, felt like we held both views. Within our church, we have people at either end. And therefore, when I shared the image of the first Easter Sunday of Archbishop Justin presiding at a spiritual communion Eucharist at his kitchen table, there were people in our church that thought that was wonderful and liberating and creative, and there were people that were horrified.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're struggling with this.
Yeah, sure. I think this is something which is also a question which is also being discussed in many Protestant churches, I know. Father Stavros, you want to speak on this also?
I wanted to add what Father Richard said, and I wanted to just make a statement that I always say, that when I take communion, the Eucharist, to a sick person at his home, I'm bringing the whole church with me. And he's not isolated. It's not only I'm just giving him communion, but I'm bringing the whole church with me, the whole congregation with me, the whole body of Christ throughout the universe. That has to be taught to our people. And that will help them in their loneliness. If we don't give them that perspective, they will take communion and remain in their loneliness.
Yeah, true. I think to some people I know there's a lot of theological questions floating around regarding whether the legitimacy of a virtual communion, but I think to a lot of people it's been a sign of hope and fellowship. But of course, we need to discuss in theological manners how we perceive this. Well, I'd like to take I think this will probably be the last question, so I will leave a little bit of space for our president and vice president at the end of the webinar, just to say a few concluding words, if they wish to. But I got a relatively concrete question for us, still within a theological framework. I can see that from the asker. But it's more of a diagonal nature. It says, what is the evaluation of the panelists regarding pastoral care around loss and bereavement? Have our churches been able to support the local communities? Also, how about pastoral care towards pastors? How did the situation affect their own self-understanding as ministers? Have your churches been able to provide guidance to them? So a rather concrete, but still a complex question, I would say. Who would have a go on this one first? Because you will all say something, I gather. Dr. Richard Sudworth, as the main speaker, will you have a go on this one first?
Okay. Well, I think pastoral care has been mixed. And as I think has been mentioned already, many parish priests have spent hours and hours on the telephone to people, and that has been good. And it's fair to say, and all our feedback from Church of England clergy in terms of their own pastoral care and situation, it's been devastating for some. So some clergy have had to isolate, and it has been extraordinarily stressful and disabling time for many. So that sense of well, the apophatic route that Father Kofinas described to some extent, as many parish priests have had to really embrace that journey. You know, what are they for? What is their ministry? And that's been sometimes a place of deep crisis. One very practical solution, which I know some of our dioceses have done, is bishops in some dioceses have rung all their clergy each month, have a personal call with their bishop regularly. Now, you may be surprised that doesn't happen as a matter of course anyway, but that there's been intentionality about that, and I know that's been very helpful.
Thank you so much. Dr. Fischel, would you have a comment on this one?
Thank you very much, General Secretary Sørensen. I think the pastoral care is one of the most important tasks of a pastor or a priest. One of the most important, because we have to take care of our church members, of course. This is our task. This is why we are pastors. We have taken care of our church members. This is basic. When I was a parish pastor in a village for 15 years, I always went to the houses and visited them and prayed with the people physically. I like these physical contacts very much, to go to a family, to go to a house. In my village, there were 167 houses. I visited all of the 167 houses every year once. It was very important for me to go to the church members, to talk with them, maybe for 20 minutes, maybe for less, maybe for more. But it's very important. And now let's not forget that the pastor needs pastoral care also. And we talk very little about this topic, that we need pastoral care also. Who is our pastor? Do we have a pastor as pastors, as priests? Is there someone in our life whom I can talk seriously? It should be my dean, it should be my bishop, or it should be my friend or a colleague. Who should it be? It's very, very interesting, the question that whom do we trust? Is it good that a bishop who is above me is my boss? We have this kind of or I should go for another person who is not my boss, who is my friend, or how should I deal with these kind of questions? I think these are important issues, and we have to talk about it. And this is one of the most important things, how we as pastors take care of ourselves. In Hungary, a lot of pastors don't go for holiday, for example. I don't know how it is in other countries, but in Hungary, not much pastors go. They say, yes, I go for a camp with the summer school with the children who are belonging to the congregation for 1 week, but it is not their personal, individual holiday. So I think we have to take it seriously. Thank you.
Yes. A final word from Father Stavros Kofinas on this one.
First of all, I want to say in the Orthodox Church, the Eucharist can not be separated from pastoral care. It is part of pastoral care. That's the first thing. The second is that during the pandemic, there has been restrictions because we can't go to the houses and sometimes not even been able to keep communion. I know many parishes though who mobilized their parishioners to have contact with one another. In other words, not just for the pastor to have contact, but it was from the pastor, from the community itself to mobilize to be in contact, which really was helpful. The Ecumenical Patriarchate did have a consultation for the COVID, which dealt with many pastoral issues that lasted for 3 months. Every other week, we had people from all over the world on the consultation, and we dealt with many of these topics, and they're on YouTube. You can find them. But I think, to be honest, that we still are deficient in helping people in their fears and in their panic. And there's a lot of fear and panic during the pandemic. And it's interesting, and I'll underline this, that now that things are opening up, there's even more fear and panic that things are opening up, because it seems like a lot of people became institutionalized in their homes and they're afraid to come out into the world. So we have that issue too to deal with. We have more training to do, and we have to be a little bit more conscientious of how we can deal with all these topics.
I think this is a wise and good way to finish the webinar this afternoon. There's still a long way to go, I think. Just to draw one conclusion for what we've heard this afternoon, as you know, I started out saying this was an attempt to focus on some of the positive outcomes, if there were any. And certainly there are some, but I still sense that we haven't finished with the struggles and the challenges yet, and of course they are there. We tend to roll back into discussions on how do we deal with this difficult question, how do we deal with this hard situation, which is fair enough. It's been a difficult time for everyone, and certainly also for the churches in our societies. One thing that we didn't touch upon today, which I think personally is very interesting, is we did slightly, I think Dr. Richard Sudworth, in your keynote address, you did mention the relationship between church and state and how that has been affected by the current crisis. I think that's very interesting. So in some places it's been improved because there has been a need for improved coordination and communication between church and state. And in other parts of Europe, it's been deteriorating because churches feel that the state has been taking too much control over church life. So that's something to be explored. And I think this is, as I started out saying a few moments ago, we're still struggling with how to deal with the situation. And I think what we've done today is, well, it's not KEC who has taken this initiative. It's been taken by many other actors also. But I say we're still in the beginning phase of an analysis and a period of evaluation of what has been done and what has been good, what can be carried on, and so on and so forth. We're only scratching the surface this afternoon. But it's been good scratching the surface with you. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Richard Sudworth, for your keynote address, and to you, Father Stavros Kofinas and Dr. Vilmos Fischel for your responses. And of course, I would like to thank the people who were submitting questions for us to explore, and for everybody else who was present this afternoon. I hope you've had a good time, and you will bring from this webinar some inspiration that you will channel into your churches and your own communities and constituencies in a constructive and helpful manner. If this is the case, I think we have succeeded with the webinar from KEC this afternoon. So much for me. As moderator, I would like to call on President Krieger again, if you would like to say a few words. I think my assistant will allow you in, and then the speakers will have their cameras switched off. Thank you. Microphone, Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much to the panelists for that inspiring discussion and contributions. It's great to listen to you. Yeah, we experienced in a way a broader resonance of the church during that pandemic time, a kind of appetite for the gospel, for spirituality, and for church life. And it's great to have also figures, and thank you for the keynote, to have figures to take this consideration. It's also interesting to see how quickly very fundamental questions were simply experienced, sometimes surprising or horrifying, as you said, but in normal time we would have to take years to debate on them before trying to do first steps, and that underlines how quickly things are changing. We had a debate with several leaders to say, is the time now ready to close the brackets of the pandemic and to come back to normal church life? And it is clear also in your contribution that we are moving in a mixed church life, which take now in consideration that digital church life. Often I think, and I will conclude with this, that what we experience bring churches to think really on the added value when we have a presential celebration or face-to-face meetings. The Eucharist is definitely one issue. Singing together probably also, because we communicate in another way when we sing together. And perhaps also all what is linked to conviviality, to laughing, sharing thoughts and discussions. It is another way to communicate when you are in a face-to-face meeting. This is a real challenge if we want to improve our church life, our communities, to think about real added value when we have face-to-face meeting. That's, in my point of view, the real challenge we are now facing. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you, Jørgen, for sharing in a such agréable, I would say in French. It was a pleasant manner, this webinar. And thank you for all those who participate. I hope it was inspiring for you, and I wish you a good end of this day, and God bless you. Thank you very much.